It's my pleasure to introduce somebody who has been a constant, gentle, but focused force in ASAIO for a long period of time, almost all the time that I've been in ASAIO, Dr. Arnold Lande. Arnie is a trained surgeon and an inventor who has confronted one problem after another in the area of cardiac materials and renal apparatuses of various kinds and some other things along the way, and I'm just going to let him to tell you about it. So, Arnie, please.
I think
You might start with your origins and your where you came from and when you first arrived at the society, and take a historical line if you can. Okay?
Let's go for it. I'm very fortunate in many, many ways, one of which is that my father, who was one of the pioneers of atomic physics and then of quantum theory, had the good sense to come to the United States from Germany in about 1928. He was a visiting professor at Ohio State, decided to stay, and so I was born here in 1931, which is very, very good for me. And grew up in a wonderful family, never felt stress within the family. We had a summer place in Michigan that still plays a very, very important role for me. And I think it was one of the most important educational parts of my life because I spent my whole days as a small child watching some wonderful boat builders build boats, wooden boats. Spend my whole day down there. They'd have a Coke for me when they had their beers. And seeing these people create things out of God's earth, if you will, was an amazing thing and has kept with me all my life. My mother, by the way, was a physician, but she stopped her practice for 25 years to raise her sons. And that was a time when bacterial infections were of great concern, and she didn't want to bring bacteria home to her family. So it was that kind of a wonderful family I had to grow up in. And many peccadillos in between. Amherst College, which probably wasn't the right place for me. But I went to medical school in Cleveland. And interestingly, in my last year, a couple of things happened. One was that I met Pim Kalf, who was at Cleveland Clinic, who I didn't even know existed. I didn't know anything about artificial organs. Also at that time, one of our surgical patients had a bad GI bleed and was going on, and our professor said if we only had one of those machines that Cleveland Clinic has that cools stomachs. And that was a challenge to me, I guess, already in creating something. So overnight I went to one of the storerooms in the medical school and found enough bits and pieces to create a cooling machine and borrowed a balloon from the Cleveland Clinic. And that got me to the University of Minnesota because Dr. Owen Wangenstein was cooling stomachs and then freezing stomachs, and an internship I probably wouldn't have gotten otherwise. I was never a good student, and I hate to have to go into that, but will if necessary. Anyway, I made it through and made it to Case Western, made it out of there to an internship and residency at the University of Minnesota, which was a tremendously creative place. We used to say an intern could come up with any absolutely wild idea, and it would be honored and it would be tried, and you could do an endless number of things. It was a wonderful, wonderful place, and I was at first with Dr. Owen Wangenstein in his laboratory doing gastric cooling, things like that, and then moved over to Dr. C. Walton Lillehei, who was really doing the early years of cardiac surgery at that time. Dick DeWall in his lab had created the first bubble oxygenator. And somehow I saw that everybody said, well, a membrane oxygenator would be a better thing. Got into that. And this is where my relationship with ASAIO really started. Coming to one of the earliest meetings.
What year was that now?
It would have been about 1964, 65, thereabouts.
Okay.
Somehow found my way to ASAIO because I had already had an idea for how to build a membrane oxygenator, an oxygenator that would be disposable, and everything looked like it needed to be disposable at that time. and the alternatives were things that had to be taken apart and sterilized, and the whole thing took about a week. And so it was a breakthrough thing, and it was the first of the mass manufacturable oxygenators.
And this was the Lande Edwards
The Lande
oxygenator.
Edwards, yeah.
Right.
And the first thing was called the Lande Lillehei. It was an experimental. It was a little cube about so big. And then Edwards Laboratories people came around and introduced me to Mr. Edwards, who had founded their laboratory and their company. And together, admittedly, at that point, they took over most of the engineering, created the Lande Edwards oxygenator. But I was very much involved in testing that and pioneering its use, if you will, through some of the mishaps that are inevitable. Some of the first ones they sent me for my laboratory, and by that time we had moved to New York.
That is, Dr. Lillehei moved to New York, and
He
you were
moved
part
to
of the
New
tribe
York.
that went
Yes,
from
and
there.
I was part of that tribe.
And where was he? At Cornell?
At Cornell, New York Hospital,
Right.
Cornell. I'm the fellow who drove the truck with all the equipment that we looted from Minnesota.
Okay.
So I kind of came ahead of the crowd. I'm just thinking the kind of things you go through in developing a device is the first ones that Edwards sent to me. I'd attach a dog to it, and the dog would instantly keel over dead, just not a second. And it turned out that the reason was that in order to keep the membranes separated, these were kind of sticky silicon rubber membranes, they had to be dusted with a powder. Well, they were using talcum powder. And of course, when that bolus of talcum powder went into the dog, that kind of put him out instantaneously. So we shifted over to salt, and some people still complain about the salt that they had to wash out, but it was a lot better than talcum powder. I think another kind of in the evolution of some of the other ideas, the oxygenator was pretty successful, but it wasn't as good. It couldn't stand up to the hollow fibers that are so much more uniform and where you can really put the blood through in a more efficient way. And admittedly, too, it wasn't as useful as Ted Colobow's wind them one at a time coil, but which Bob Bartlett, after he started with mine, shifted over to. And Bob Bartlett, of course, has done wonderful work through the years of developing ECMO as with using membrane oxygenators and supporting patients for a long period of time.
But let's keep the focus on you now. So there you are with Lillehei in New York, and you've made this contribution. Whatever you say about its ultimate fate, it was a necessary step in the evolution, and if it hadn't occurred, other things probably wouldn't have. So what happened next to you?
Okay, let me just say that while I was there too, I was the beneficiary, had already been in Minnesota, and we were able to move to New York. Probably the biggest grant that any resident has ever had between the Artificial Heart Agency and the Artificial Kidney Agency, about $100,000 a year. That was quite a lot of money at that time. I might say that I lobbied Frank Hastings year after year and plagued him with proposals year after year when he said that this was an artificial heart program, not an artificial lung program, and so it wasn't suitable. Eventually, a request for proposals came out. I got to do one of those and was able to do that work in New York while I was a resident, while I was taking some years off from the clinical training. The other thing that I wanted to accomplish with that money, as I said, some of it came from kidney, was to do a wearable artificial kidney. It seemed to me just another dialyzer was not a big thing. There were a lot of them out there, probably better than anything I would come up with.
That was a long time before that idea became popular.
Absolutely, but I wanted to do that. That seemed to me like that would be the significant thing. And but the bits and pieces weren't there yet. I won't go into the details. They just weren't there yet. But at the present time, that's probably my biggest focus. And one way or another, we could get up to that point. I would only say that I finished my training, went to Medical University of South Carolina in Charleston, and then to Houston, Texas.
And how long were you in Charleston? Just
Charleston,
a year?
about 3 years.
3
about
years.
3 years, yeah.
What were those years?
73 through 76.
Uh-huh. Okay, so then you wound up in Houston.
76 into Houston and stayed there for about 10 years, till about 86.
And who did you relate to in Houston?
I was initially, took a year in the lab at Texas Heart Institute with Jack Norman, and kind of did some of my things, did some of their things, and then moved over to Herman Hospital, the new medical school there, and was on the thoracic staff there, and did some of my own practice, a lot of the emergency things that would come in, still being very much interested in the lab things. And
but you were doing doc stuff in those days.
I was a doc very definitely, and a cardiac surgeon, and a trauma surgeon, whatever came into that very active trauma hospital, all of which was good. And after 10 years in Houston, where I think the most significant thing I did as far as the research side, I got a very, very small grant, interestingly enough, from the funding agency of the government, not NIH itself. All agencies were required to put a little bit of money into a part of their SBIR program, part of their research.
So this is the beginning of this SBIR model
SBIR,
that
yeah.
people are taking a lot of advantage of these days,
Yes.
right?
It was fairly early, but it was especially small SBIR because this agency didn't have to put that much into it.
And what was that for?
What I used that for was to test the concept of a small dialyzer being used continuously would be as effective as a large dialyzer being used intermittently. So we made some small dialyzers, and we used a ready machine, which reconstitutes dialysate and a number of things. And it was successful, but it was small and did not lead to a phase 2. And at that point in time, I went back to Minnesota, thinking that with all the medical device industry there, that might be really the place for me to be.
And what year was that now? That was
That
in the
would have
80s
been
or?
about 86.
86,
Yeah.
okay. So we've got you into 86. And all this time, I guess you've been rowing too, haven't you?
Yeah, the wonderful thing, when I moved to Minneapolis, I was on my own then, and as far as family-wise, and I decided to not go into some small, dingy apartment, but rather to a nice place by the Mississippi River, look down, watch people rowing, got into it, and for the last 25 years or so, it's been a passion of mine. And I think there's even a small anecdote that is interesting medically. I did all kinds of medical work, among other words. I was a house physician in a hospital where I'd go up to the psych floor and sew up lacerations and such. And I had a dream one night where I was up there observing a psychiatric conference, and all the different patients were introducing themselves. I'm Bill, I'm a psychotic, or I'm Joe, I'm an alcoholic. They turned to me and I said, I'm Arnie, I'm a rower. And when I tell my rowing friends that, they all understand. That's not, we're all that deeply into it. And I still am. I still enjoy it very much. And
So what were you doing professionally then at that point? What were you doing?
I was essentially doing anything I could to keep myself alive, and that worked out best was rather than trying to build a surgical practice, which would have had many difficulties anyway, to be a outstate emergency doctor on the weekends, go out for 60 hours, and that left the weekdays free for me.
And you were innovating at that time.
I was
right?
innovating.
What were you innovating? What were you doing?
I've got a dozen things that are in my pocket that are ready to go, and among them, I think it's, if we talk about innovating, let's talk about innovating. This is, for instance, one of the things I came up with before I left Houston, and that is a total artificial heart. And I have to tell you that I put that on hold for 15, 20 years while the world was really not wanting a total artificial heart anymore, the way they wanted the assist devices. But this one is, I think it's emblematic of my creative process, which is when I see people up against a wall, but that they can't seem to go any farther with, to sneak around the other side, see whether you can approach it from that side. And a lot of the problems with total artificial hearts, with flexing of membranes and with shedding of clots from emboli, from valves, emboli, and so on, are kind of, I think, taking care of this. And Bud Fraser's had one of these on his desk for years, tells everybody it's great, but we haven't done anything with it. And said that as recently as yesterday. But most of the hearts, just to illustrate this creative process, most of the artificial hearts are hard chambered. They have a diaphragm across the middle. Something, probably air, is pumped in on one side or the other to move that flexing diagram, and the flexing isn't at all good, to pump the blood on the other side. And this one, on the other hand, instead of pushing from the outside in like an ordinary heart, it pumps from the inside out. You can see that innermost of 3 diaphragms, which is getting larger and smaller, and that's doing the actual pumping. But this whole thing is as soft as a jellyfish, unlike those hard chambered things I was talking about. And as far as the valves go, and let me just go a little bit farther, the innermost pumping chamber presses on the next chamber, which is the left heart, the high pressure chart, and by Laplace's law and so on, that retains a higher pressure. Around that, in turn, is the left heart, which is the lower pressure side of the heart, and then a so-called compliance chamber around that. But there are a number of advantages. You don't have to cross the pulmonary artery and the artery. You can bring these ducts out anywhere. 2 of them lead into the inner chamber, the left heart, and 2 of them into the outer chamber, the right heart. And
Now, did you get a patent on that?
I did, but that's long since run out, unfortunately. But all you really have to do to motivate this thing is just put a fluid in and out. It could be a little pump that pumps back and forth between the pumping chamber and the compliance chamber. Regular rate, although I'll tell you in a minute, we're actually going to be retaining the atrial node, so we have a timing system for it. And the other thing is we aren't going to replace the valves at all. The only thing we're going to replace is this muscular part. And the valves are perfectly good in most failure patients, so why should we replace them? As I say, retain the atrial node and all the functions as the atria do. And so looking down, if the surgeon is looking down at the patient's chest, he sees, once the ventricular muscles have been cut away, he sees what's called the skeleton of the heart that has the 4 valves in it, 2 of them going one way, 2 of them going the other. You're going to have to suspend the little chordae tendineae, which can be done easily enough with a Velcro arrangement. He's looking at it, he can make it do exactly what he wants, and only replace this part of it. And this whole thing could fit inside a pericardium. And having attended the pediatric conference, realize these things could be made as small as you want. They're made the same way as an intra-aortic balloon or a dilation catheter on the inside of a glass mold. So we could make any size artificial heart on this basis. And it would be pulsatile and do a lot of things that an ordinary heart. So I just wanted to illustrate the idea that you come up against a really difficult problem in medicine, and everybody's bashing their heads against trying to solve that. You go around the other side, look at it, maybe there's a real easy way that solves all your problems at once. I mean, there are going to be other problems here, but I wanted to get that in. And I think a number of the things that that might someday, my name might be connected with, were come across in that way.
And that's true. I mean, the patent may run out, and it may not mean that when life is over that you'll have the largest stone in the graveyard. But on the other hand, there will be a permanent memory of the fact that these things were as they are.
Well, I
But
can say
go
though
on
that
and
some
talk about some more things, because
Okay,
I know
sure.
you have more to say.
Well, let's jump to what's is most important at this point in time, but there are others, and I hope we won't miss those. And that goes back to the idea of the wearable artificial kidney. And through the years, about 40 years of thinking about it, you gradually, one time or another, say, maybe I ought to go around to the other side, or that type of thing. And the big problem remaining with artificial kidney has been blood access. And being able to have access to blood 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for the rest of your life. It doesn't have to be, I mean, the kidney isn't that vital. But rather than going in for dialysis 3 days a week, never really getting rid of all the toxins, always living a lesser life, to be able to go into your full life if you could be dialyzing constantly with an excess of capacity like you and I have. So came up with this very simple thing, And the beauty of it is that what I have here is what other people have been doing all the time for years. The first part of it is making the arteriovenous fistula, which is the standard for hemodialysis blood access. After having gone through grafts and through the skin things and so on, the standard hemodialysis access now is to make a connection between an artery and a vein. Then a whole lot of arterial blood runs into the veins, the whole network of veins over your forearm, and makes those all big and useful for dialysis for years to come, hopefully. And sometimes, however, that doesn't work. The vessels are expected to mature. If they don't get turned into semi-arteries, or if they do and then later deteriorate, you have a problem. And I don't want to go into detail, but the way that problem is solved routinely, hundreds of times a year, if not thousands, is to put all that blood that's coming down the artery through the fistula into one blood vessel coming up the arm. And that then makes that into a very durable vessel. This might have been a failing vessel before, it becomes very durable. And if you were to do that electively, a nice fresh vein, I think you'd have something that would be very sturdy. And this is in the dialysis textbooks up to a certain point, and it's accepted as a standard thing. Now, if you did one thing further, well, we've already tied off the branches, so all the blood's coming down the one. If you do one thing further, which is to press on that vessel, then you'll have arterial pressure on one side, venous pressure on the other. Now you're really in business, because you have access to blood that's likely to be durable for many years, and you have, at the same time, access to arteriovenous pressure differential. So whatever appliance you have on your arm, you don't need a pump to pump through that. You don't need to risk the air embolus and all the other problems with pumps. It's just anytime you press on this vessel, blood flows through. It might be for a few seconds for an artificial pancreas, so you just put enough of a gush of blood through that can be analyzed for glucose and then goes on and make its quick decision and put the insulin that's needed back into the bloodstream. Or for dialysis, you might have this on for intermittently hours, one way or the other. You can shift the pressure point. You can do things by audible feedback to avoid getting too much pressure on a vessel and hurting it. All kinds of refinements.
This is an AV shunt.
It's an AV shunt that can be turned.
You put the pressure on the AV shunt.
Right.
When you want to have an AV pressure difference going
right,
out.
Right, exactly.
And so,
but it's an AV shunt with the ligation of the accessory vein, so it remains an A on one side and isn't V on the other.
Right. And so it's wide open when you're not using it to get blood out?
Just like any other AV fistula.
But of course then it will augment or force an augmentation of the cardiac output to some extent.
But not much. We're talking about something which could be, for instance, it could be in just a stay open.
Good.
You could use this device here with, as I say, audible feedback, like when you're listening and taking your own blood pressure. You can tell them how much flow is through there. So if that were a problem, otherwise, though, the amount of blood that's going through here, like anybody else's AV fistula, in most patients is not going to be significant.
Now, what did you do with this? As I recall, you spent some time down in Kentucky and so on, and we're back making presentations here about kidneys. Let's hear a little more.
Well, let me explain that. That was really kidney directed, and Jay Swishenberger had some money down there, invited me down. We built a prototype, got so far with it, and then had some problems, just an engineering accident that slowed us down. The money ran out, and I came back, and at that point, I had a realization, one which was that the kidney people all seemed to recognize that continuous dialysis would probably be better than intermittent, but they weren't ready to jump to that. They weren't ready to make a big thing out of it. And Victor Gura was going to study his wearable kidney, kind of a larger approach, and had some money to do that, and he was going to demonstrate, and is still doing so, that continuous is better than intermittent, which makes sense to everybody, but that's still underway. People weren't screaming for a wearable artificial kidney. So I shifted my interest over to artificial pancreas, and diabetes is quite a different matter. It's huge, and for instance, Juvenile Diabetes Research Association were able to recruit 100,000, I'm sure that's correct, patients to sign a petition to the FDA to set up a protocol that people could follow, developing an artificial pancreas. When they got through it, they were done. They wouldn't be called back to do 100 different things. Just for instance, that kind of interest. And the other thing being just the financial side of what it's costing. Diabetes and its complications cost the developed world $500 billion a year going out for that.
Now, what is your thinking about that? How do you want to intersect with that situation?
For one thing, I think that if we can maintain continuous, very fine control of the blood glucose, that a large part of the complications would go away. I'd say 2/3 of that, or
And you have some ideas about that?
Get our wearable artificial pancreas into use, and it is worn on the forearm, plugged into the same axis that we've said. It automatically presses on the vessel every however long you want to it, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever. A gush of blood goes through. It tells you exactly what the blood sugar is in the blood and makes the necessary correction. And I should say that this is in stark contrast, which is what all the other people who are working on artificial pancreas are doing. They are accessing not blood, but subcutaneous tissue. And they were told years ago that you cannot access blood continuously. Well, I never believed that. I'm a vascular surgeon, other vascular surgeons, other members of SIO who do dialysis every day knows that you can get access one way, if not continuously, but intermittently. Not much difference there. And we can do this thing. So based on that, and based on work that was done in the 60s and 70s, the so-called biostatter, which is a bedside, blood-based artificial pancreas, which to this day is the platinum standard for artificial pancreas, but bedside control. And they talk about putting a clamp on blood sugar. They can hold your blood sugar at a higher level or a lower level just by operating this machine. We want to put that machine on somebody's forearm.
And you have a lot of patents, as I understand. We were talking the other night. How many do you have?
Oh, I don't know, a dozen or so, but a bunch of them are out of date. That's the trouble, if you don't do something.
They're a permanent record of your thoughts,
sure. Yeah, no,
and a development that's certified as innovative, or you couldn't have gotten the patent.
There's sort of a financial record of me too, because half of my income, much of my life, has gone into the patents. But I figure they're worthwhile.
And you've been a very active figure in ASAIO too.
Let me just go back.
Okay, please do.
For a moment. When you say patents, just a few days ago I was issued a patent on this blood access system. So now we really have something to work with, and I think we'll be able to move forward and get this kind of thing in production and into use.
Now, how are you going to manage that? You're looking for people that will want to license that patent, I guess, huh?
I'm not sure exactly how to go. There are many different ways you can go once you have this. I think it needs to be developed a bit farther in order to demonstrate its real use and how I'm going to hook up with people. I might say that I've shifted my domicile to the little town I started talking about with Northport, Michigan. Tiny town at the tip of a peninsula, and I want to turn that little town into Woods Hole, Massachusetts, and have some active research institutes there and things of that nature, having to do with maritime and artificial organs and diving system. I'll talk about that shortly, probably.
Yeah, that's a whole part of your life that you were very active in 20 years ago or so ago, and you haven't told us about that. Well, if we have a few minutes more, I hope you can, because I think it'd be good.
I hope we will, yeah.
Talk about that.
Well, yes, indeed. Let me make sure if Oh, I was going to say the part that's not Woods Hole that I think we might do it differently would be to do some manufacturing up there. And this would provide jobs and opportunities for people in that part of Michigan. And why go back to Minneapolis? Why go to California to do this? I think we could do it there.
So you're a social reformist on top of everything else.
On top of everything else.
Okay, so...
Okay, diving. The reason, one reason I want to stay in Northport, Michigan is there's a wonderful supply of lake water there. And one of the things that also came out of the oxygenator is the artificial gill. 40 years ago, the Navy put a huge amount of money into the idea of liquid breathing as a way of doing ultra-deep diving because you would totally avoid the bends. The bends come from the diluting gas that you dilute the oxygen with when you're going to the depths to keep your lungs inflated so that you don't become crushed. And that nitrogen or other inert gas dissolves out into the blood and causes great problems when you come up. It bubbles out like in a Coke bottle. But if you started out with giving the patient his oxygen, his liquid breathing from a liquid, particularly a fluorocarbon liquid, which contains a lot of oxygen, that you could do this without the inert gases. He would get all the oxygen he needs. He would discharge his CO2 into that same liquid, and when he came up, his blood gases would be just as they had been at the surface, and he would never be faced by the bends. But the Navy went into huge efforts with that, some important names connected with that, and they could never get rid of the CO2. They could get lots of oxygen in to the lungs through the oxygenated liquid, but the CO2 did not come out as readily for a number of reasons. And so that's where they got stalled. But then Ted Colabo and other people did their wonderful work taking CO2 off of patients' blood by putting only about 1/5 of the cardiac output through a membrane oxygenator, the equivalent of an artificial gill, and we're off and running. And add to that the difficulty of work of breathing. Use a cuirass respirator, which is a cuirass named after medieval armor, encircles your chest, but is really just a mini artificial, iron lung that expands and helps your blood in and out from the outside. Mm-hmm. So you don't have to try to expand or aid the lungs with invasive catheters that are inevitably going to do a lot of problems. And finally, the realization that this could all be done veno-venous, withdrawing the amount of blood that you need and putting it back in. So this is something a diver could do again and again. Well, that's another reason I'm in Northport, Michigan. This little laboratory I'm wanting to put together there is right on the lake shore, and we'll be able to test these things and go out in the lakes. And that's my excuse for grabbing that important historic building there and building a laboratory into it. I'd like to get that going. And I don't want to name names at this point, but a very prominent American who's greatly interested in diving. I corresponded with him several years ago. I can imagine he might finance such a thing, and that would be off and running.
Now, that would be a nice thing as you come to perhaps the last third of your career or something like that, to do that.
I have to tell you, I have great confidence in that. My grandmother lived to be over 100, and I'm hopeful that I have her physiology. But every other day, like every other physician, I've noticed something about myself. I say, oh my God, it's the end. So.
What do you think of ASAIO and all of this? Do you think it's a bona fide organization? How would you change it?
Well, let me start out with it. It was about the most wonderful association I've ever been associated with. And that first trip to Chicago or wherever we were, I think it was Atlantic City, and somehow indicated I had an idea about how to do a dialyzer or support membranes, and got into a hotel room up there with Bill Blumley and Galletti and a number of other people. We spent the whole night just talking back and forth. It was the most stimulating thing that ever happened to me. So I've attended about every meeting since. I haven't gotten involved in the administration. Just, it's not my inclination.
The first meeting you went to was when? In the 70s then, do you think?
Would have been about 1965.
65, right.
Yeah, right in there. It was when shortly after I'd gotten to Minnesota and found out about membrane oxygenators. Might have been a couple of years later.
Mm-hmm. And do you think the society is the same now as it was then, or is it?
Well, I haven't been in any upstairs hotel rooms with students, but that's because I'm more of a detached person. I have a feeling that many of the professors seem to arrive now with a whole retinue of students. And I kind of observed that the other day and said, is that really the best thing for these kids to be just relating with their professor and who's introducing the other professors and getting a little bit of note for himself by saying, I know this guy, I know that guy. They maybe never really move out of that orbit. Another of their professor's orbit, that's not important. It was wonderful in the days when everybody met in one room. Everybody talked up about all subjects, and there was a real strong exchange between people here. Here you can still do it. If you just overcome your inhibitions and walk up with anybody and start talking with them, it's amazing what you find out.
And I saw you do that yesterday, even in a meeting.
Yeah.
So I think that ball is carried by fewer and fewer people as time goes on, but
Yeah.
you're certainly still doing it.
No, I think that's very important.
You published a fair amount in ASAIO.
Yeah.
And, is it the prime place that you've published, do you think?
I think so. I mean, I can, looking back, I would say there are a lot of shortcomings that I haven't gone out to push my things as effectively as I should have. I haven't published as much. Right now, I have on my plate one about, for the ASIO journal, I've just determined to do this, and this is the place, obviously should be a paper on the blood access, and one on the kidney, and one on the pancreas applications. But just let me throw in here, there's liver, there's aquapheresis for congestive heart failure, a number of other kinds of phereses, many different things that could be done with this system, which is really, I think of it as a third, I'm getting a little bit grandiose here, but a third method for treating chronic disease. After enteral, which is by mouth, parenteral by needle, the third one will be continuous extracorporeal. And I think an awful lot might be done in the future with a lot of chronic diseases.
I think you illustrate something that I've seen in the ASAIO. There are a few people like you who are not confined by the constraints of practice in a given disease area, but rather think in terms of a physical or biological concept that overreaches and can land wherever it needs to land. And I think that's what you're saying, isn't it?
I think for one thing, I'm a gadgeteer. I'm not an engineer in any sense. I'm frightened of math, frightened of formulas, things of that nature. All I learned that I use, I learned in high school physics, kind of a guy. Push here, pull there, and so on. And that's really what most of those are like. But I think,
remember you recruiting
yeah.
me to make some calculations
Sure,
for you.
exactly, and they're down on my poster right now, same ones.
And I think that that's important. That is not what I did is important. What's important is someone who sees what he needs and knows enough people to go to get the things. So you don't only go to me to do something, but you go to other people and they contribute, and you become not just a gadgeteer, but someone who assembles a process or assembles a toolbox to attack a problem.
This is another part of the innovative thing. I'm fortunate to have been doing surgery, cardiac surgery, parts of the heart-lung machine, so I'm familiar with that side. I know that soft things are going to fit in the chest better than hard things. I know from having helped in total heart and lung transplants what a huge space is created there, and I've determined to make an implantable artificial lung to set, or a heart and lung to set in there. So on the one side, that surgical, medical thing, and on the other side, being enough of a gadgeteer so that I could at least employ a number of bioengineers and I think keep them very busy.
Now, I didn't try to direct this conversation very much. Is there anything I should have touched on or anything more you'd like to say before they shut us off here?
I think we've gone through an awful lot, and I appreciate it so much. I better think about this. I don't want to go into I love ASIO, and I think that ASIO has developed in wonderful ways. maybe it ought to become 2 silos. I don't know. Some thought ought to be given whether it is as fully irrigating as it could be. But these are minor thoughts. I love it. It's been great for me. I've made my whole career, and this kind of tops it off to be able to spout out here and with a good friend. Let me just go way back to Ed Leonard for a moment. When I came to New York, I was a lonely fellow at a big medical center. My professor wasn't even there yet, and who was I going to interrelate with anything that was innovative or device-oriented and so on? Ed somehow finally included me in on his similar section to the hotel room that I'd had earlier with very, very creative people. We met once a month, something like that, and it was wonderful.
That was the seminars on biomaterials.
And we always had a
particularly.
great dinner at the faculty club at Columbia, and that was
Yep,
an important. I
that's
hadn't
true.
thought about that since.
Well, on this high note of your praise for ASAIO, I think we could bring this to a close, and I think it was
Great.
wonderful. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.